Welcome to NOAA Live Alaska. My name is Lisa Hiruki-Raring, and I'm going to be moderating today's webinar. This series is a collaborative effort by NOAA Fisheries Alaska Fisheries Science Center, where I work, NOAA's Alaska Regional Collaboration Network, and NOAA's National Weather Service. This webinar series is designed to help you get to know NOAA's work in Alaska and how we connect and work with your communities. NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, studies the ocean and the atmosphere and where the two meet, from weather to ocean to the animals that live around us. All of our speakers work for some part of NOAA or work in partnership with NOAA. We hope this gives you a sneak peek at different career paths you might be interested in. Today, we're introducing you to Crane Johnson, who works for NOAA's National Weather Service's Alaska Pacific River Forecast Center in Anchorage, Alaska. While we'll be talking about NOAA's role in research and stewardship, we want to recognize that we're all coming to you from the traditional lands of Native communities who have substantial Indigenous knowledge and much to share with us. In Alaska, Crane's work is conducted all over the state, which include the traditional homelands and waters of the Nupiat, Yupiat, Siberian Yupiat, Athabaskan, Ununga, Alutiiq-Sippiaq, Eyak, Tlingit, Haida, and Tsimshian. We are honored to acknowledge that Crane is presenting this webinar from Anchorage, Alaska, the ancestral land of the Dena'ina people who have stewarded this area for thousands of years. The community thrives thanks to their continued sharing of vision, wisdom, values, and leadership. We'd also like to acknowledge that we're hosting this webinar from the traditional lands of the first people of Seattle, the Duwamish people, past and present. A few guidelines before I hand you over to our speaker. You're all muted because we have a lot of people on the line and we want to make sure everyone can hear our speaker. However, there's a box where you can write questions and we encourage you to ask them as we go. My colleague Chris Beyer and I will be keeping track of questions for Crane behind the scenes. He'll stop every now and again and answer a few questions. We might not get to all of our questions, but we'll try to answer as many as we can. All right, I'll hand it over to Crane to introduce himself.
Okay, thanks, Lisa. Can you hear me and see me okay?
Yep, looks good.
Great, all right. Hey, thanks everybody for joining us, and thanks Lisa for that great introduction and inviting the RFC to present in this webinar series. Excited to do that and share what we do up here in Alaska for Alaskans. A quick look at what I'll talk about today. We'll start off with just hydrology in the National Weather Service, provide a little bit of a background, my background, how I got into hydrology, why I think it's so interesting. We'll go in and look at breakup and ice jams. We're right in now in Alaska. We're sort of at the front edge of our breakup period. And it's a time when you see in this picture to the right, most of our rivers are ice covered. And so it's a time when we expect that ice cover to break up and our rivers to open up. During breakup, we have a program called Riverwatch. It's sort of our eyes in the sky to monitor breakup. We'll look at that. And then towards the end, I'll provide a little bit of an outlook for what we expect with this year's breakup. Before I go to the next slide, we'll just look quickly at what is a hydrologist. And so hydro comes from the Greek word for water, and hydrology is the study of water. So hydrologists are scientists who study water. Short little sort of how I got started in hydrology. I grew up on the East Coast of the United States, Pennsylvania. I moved to Alaska in 1995 and went to the University of Alaska Fairbanks and got a degree in civil engineering. Then I had a few different jobs. I was always very interested in water, and then came back to work for the federal government, both for the Corps of Engineers and then for the National Weather Service as a hydrologist. If you're interested in hydrology, curious about careers in hydrology, especially in the Weather Service, there's a great website that they've put together. You can sort of read my story and a few other folks' story from across the country. It sort of gives you an idea of how we all got into it. I think one thing is in common, like all hydrologists really enjoy water. I've always been interested in water. You know, as a young kid, all the way through college and in my career, I'm still fascinated by water and ice. Quick way to get there is you can just Google search NWS careers in hydrology. So this is how I look at Alaska. The map in the top right gives you some perspective of where Alaska is compared to the lower 48, the US lower 48 states. We're off to the west and way up to the north. When I look at Alaska or think about Alaska, I tend to focus on rivers. I think most people look at maps with roads, and so I always enjoy this map. It's our state with our rivers shown. One of the rivers we're most concerned with, and this year is no exception, is the Yukon River there, shown in red. And the Yukon River is the third longest river in North America. And if you sort of stretch the Yukon River from end to end, it'll go from the west coast to California all the way east to about Alabama. The other thing that's really important with our rivers in Alaska is that's where communities are, that's where people live. And so you see that just about every community outside of Anchorage and Fairbanks are located on one of our rivers around the state. I think as a hydrologist, one thing I've really enjoyed is we can study it in the office, but then it really is a field activity. We have to be out there and look at our rivers, measure our rivers. And so one thing I've really enjoyed over the years is that through work, I've been able to visit all these different spots around Alaska. And my plan is to keep visiting different spots. I tend to spend anywhere from sort of 1 to 3 or 4 weeks a year out in the field, either during breakup or during the rest of the summer open water season. So breakup, really, what is it? It's in Alaska, we're up in the north, and what happens in the winter is almost all of our rivers freeze with a continuous ice cover. And so that photo on the left is sort of the end of winter, sort of first signs of spring, and it's what we see when we head out, and that's basically every river is frozen. The photo on the right is sort of that transition. So that's breakup, where we see some open water with some ice still in place, and that river is flowing sort of from the right through into the screen, so sort of at us. And that's really what breakup is. It's that transition from fully ice covered to fully open water. This is the Yukon River, both on the left and the right, 2 different locations. And just to give you some perspective, the width of the Yukon River varies, but typical width would be 10 football fields wide. And so in these photos, it's about 10 football fields wide, or about half a mile or so. So it's a big river, both in length and in width. So when rivers break up, we always think about 2 major types of breakup. On the left, you can see we've got a thermal breakup, and that's where the ice sort of safely melts in place. We often think of these as a good kind of breakup, and a breakup when we don't get flooding. And so that's really what we hope for each spring. The other type of breakup on the right is a mechanical breakup, and that's where the sort of force of the river flowing downriver pushes against the ice in place and mechanically breaks it up and can form ice jams. And we'll look a little bit later at an ice jam and actually see a jam that forms and releases. Generally, years with a mechanical breakup, we tend to see ice jams, and those are the years where we can see ice jam flooding throughout the state. The photo in the center is Akiak. This was flooding caused by an ice jam in 2009. And in 2009, it was a dynamic breakup across the state, and we had ice jam flooding on the Yukon River and other major rivers across the state. Akiak is on the Kuskokwim River, which is just south of the Yukon River. So just a quick look at an example of a thermal breakup. I think the picture on the right really shows what happens, how the ice just melts in place. And this would be similar if you live near any lakes or ponds. Those are always thermal breakups. The ice just melts in place, changes color. That affects how quickly it melts and just loses strength. One interesting thing to note in that picture, and this is typical with breakup throughout the state, is it's always generally snow-free. The snow melts in these lower elevations well before the river ice breaks up. And this is Napaskiak, again, on the Kuskokwim River. If we look on the left, that's a similar image. It's the beginning phases of a thermal breakup. We can see the ice is starting to darken. We can see outside of the river that it's already free of snow. And the other really interesting thing to note, which is really important in Alaska, is that we've got you can see that line that goes through the center of the river, and that's an ice road. And so one thing ice is really important to Alaskans for is travel in the wintertime. Normally, all those communities I showed on a map you have to fly to, and that's how I've gotten to all those, is by air. But in the wintertime, they'll build ice roads. Communities will build ice roads from one to the other, and it's much cheaper to move groceries, packages on an ice road than to fly them by plane. So during breakup, communities are really concerned about, we can travel on the ice, then there's a period during breakup when we can't, and then once it's open water, we can travel by boat. And so often communities are interested both in ice jam flooding and also how to get back and forth. So what the status of the river is. One of the common terms you'll hear for thermal breakup is mush out. It's a really mellow mush out, no flooding expected. If we look at mechanical breakups, this is where we get ice jams form and we can have flooding. On the left is Eagle, Alaska in 2013. So that was another year where we had mechanical breakups throughout the Yukon River and the Kuskokwim River. And what happens is the ice jam forms, and then upstream of the ice jam, the water level rises. And it can rise enough where it actually pushes chunks of ice outside the river. And so you can have both flooding and damage to homes, trees, structures from the ice itself. And so you can look at the picture of the ice on that road. It doesn't look that thick until you stick my boss against that ice chunk, and he's 6'6". So that sort of gives you an idea of how destructive or how large these chunks of ice that can flow over the riverbanks can be. This again was Eagle in 2013. So this is, if we took Eagle and sliced a line through the center of the river, this is what an ice jam looks like in cross section. And so on the right side of the photo image is ice in place, and that's sort of our sheet ice that's been in place all winter. And then we've got the river flow coming from left to right, and that's providing the force against the ice that can break up. And if it gets stuck, chunks of ice keep packing in to this ice jam front, we call it, and create an ice jam. And then upstream, you see on the left side of the image, we get increased water levels, and they can go up enough to flow over bank into communities. And you can see what we saw in Eagle was that it rose enough so that some of the chunks in the ice jam actually flowed over bank onto the roads, pushed homes off foundations. Often we're interested on where jams occur. They occur at river constrictions such as bridges in the lower 48. Many of the ice jams occur at bridges. In Alaska, if we look at the Yukon River and the Kuskokwim River, we have one bridge that crosses those two. So we're not as concerned about bridges on our big rivers. Sharp meanders, obstructions, islands, changes in river slope, that would be where the river comes out of the mountains and then hits a flatter area. The picture on the left is one of the most famous ice jam locations in Alaska. And so we call this Bishop's Rock. You can see the waters flowing sort of towards us past this rock on the left side of the river there. And ice jams can form, and then 20 miles upstream is the town of Galena. And so in 2013 and in other years, ice jams that formed at Bishop Rock flooded the community that was 20 miles upstream. Here's a quick look at Galena. So this is looking downstream from Galena, and Bishop's Rock would be 20 miles in the distance there. The map on the right gives you an idea of where Galena is. It's about 2/3 of the way down on the Yukon River towards the mouth. And this is an image of May 2013 when an ice jam formed at Bishop's Rock and flooded a majority of Galena. It's interesting to note that often the right side of the image you see a dry area, and that's protected by a levee. And so there was a portion of Galena that was protected by a levee, and other portions that did stay high and dry weren't affected by floodwaters. So I think what we'll do next, we saw that cross section. What we'll do is we'll take a look at an ice jam. So the next screen, I'll pull up a time-lapse video from Dawson City in Canada, Yukon Territory. And it's basically the day in the life of the Yukon River at Dawson City when it breaks up back in 2011. So I will switch. And Lisa, can you confirm that I switched? And
Yep, I can see the
No,
video. And don't forget to unmute yourself.
thank you. So this video is one day in Dawson City. We've got in-place sheet ice. The river here is flowing right to left, so from our right to our left. And what we'll see is a sort of typical spring day in the north. I think some snow comes through. Sun keeps spinning around. And what you'll need to watch for is some rapid change, and then look off to the left side of the river and you'll see an ice jam form. Snow is not uncommon in May. This is May 7th, 2011. And there the river breaks up. And then an ice jam forms on the left side there. And then that ice jam releases. And then what we'll see is there's a ice flow, we call that, and that's an ice jam that released upstream and flowing through, and then another ice flow. So that's two additional ice jams that formed and released. And so in this case, it was a mechanical breakup. It happens that quick. I've been there on rivers that break up, and basically, usually everybody has a feeling that it'll happen soon, and so the community's out watching. And it just, within a matter of minutes, the entire river starts to move. So I think what we'll do is we'll pause for any questions on breakup and ice jams.
Okay, we had a couple of people who had a little bit of a problem with the audio on your, when you were talking, when the video was on. So maybe you could share your screen again, and
Sure.
then that might help with folks hearing your audio. And for folks who can't see the video, it might have been that the video screen opened up behind your window, so that might be another solution. But one of the questions that we did have was, Theodore was wondering, what was the worst flood that ever happened from ice jams?
In Alaska, I think one of the worst floods was 2013 in Galena. That one, at least in recent memory, in sort of my professional career, probably in the last 30 or 40 years, that was one of the worst ice jam floods in Alaska.
And an associated question to that is, how long do the floods last, usually from an ice jam?
That's a good question. And just to follow up on the first question, the damages at Galena were about $70 million for that 2013. So as far as how long they last, that is unique for ice jams. They can last days. A typical sort of river flood from rainfall would be on the order of 1 or 2 days, rise and then fall. Ice jams are unique in that Galena held for several days where the water just continued to rise slowly and then release. We had an ice jam on the Kuskokwim River last year that stayed in place for nearly 5 days, then released.
And then, so Theodore was also wondering, what can people do about mechanical breakups? And you might be going to talk about that a little bit later on, but are there things that people in the villages can do?
I will cover that, and I'll say the best thing people can do is prepare. There's not much we can do to prevent ice jams, but preparation right now, this time of year, a few weeks before breakup is the time people can prepare.
So Anna Maria was asking, why do they give names for the ice jams different parts? So you showed that diagram of the ice jam, and she was wondering, why do they give the different, are there different structures within the ice jams that have separate names?
There are, and I could show a much more technical figure that identifies each part of the ice jam, and I think it's primarily so hydrologists can communicate to other hydrologists where the toe of the jam is. So that would be where it's actually meeting the in-place ice, where the top of the jam is. Sort of the jam itself we'll often call the equilibrium section, which just means it's sort of in place, not changing. But it would be like sort of, your bike has every little part labeled so you can talk to the mechanic, and it's just more for communication. So I think it's similar to that. Any science will have sort of technical terms for all the different parts.
And we had another question about floods, and you had mentioned that 2013 was a bad flood year for Galena. Was it a bad flood year on all of the rivers, or is it specific to different rivers?
Typically when we get a mechanical breakup on the Yukon and the Kuskokwim, it can be bad flooding in more than one spot. The sort of mechanism just repeats itself. Rivers break up from upstream to downstream, and that year in 2009 there was 2009 and 2013 there was flooding at Eagle, which is upstream from Galena, and then at other communities down the way, and then finally at Galena. And so it's not uncommon to have sort of major flooding at 5 to 10 communities in the same year. Years we have thermal breakups, there's typically no flooding. But years when we have mechanical breakups, it's typical to have one or more than one locations have flooding.
We actually had another question about ice jams. So are each of those flooding events caused by a separate ice jam, or are they all? Can you have several flooding events that are caused by one ice jam?
That's a great question. Generally, an ice jam forms and floods the upstream community, just like it did at Galena. When that ice jam releases, it can also flood downstream communities because you've taken sort of a big bathtub of water and pulled the plug when the jam releases. And so that same jam can flood downstream, not necessarily from an ice jam, but just from sort of the release of a tub of water. But generally what happens is an ice jam will form in Galena, or let's say Eagle, really far upstream, flood Eagle, and then it'll continue to mechanically break up. That jam will release, just like we saw in Dawson City, and then another jam will form, say downstream from Circle or for Yukon, one of the other communities. And so generally it's different ice jams that flood the different communities. On our rivers, on the Yukon, it's probably between 50 and 100 miles between communities, whereas on the Kuskokwim, maybe 5 to 10. So they're much closer down there.
Gotcha. Texas was wondering what conditions cause a mechanical breakup versus a thermal breakup?
That's a great question. So, and I'll cover it a little bit at the end, but it's generally the sort of competing forces. Snow melt, providing more water to the rivers, and then the ice in place losing strength. And so when there's smaller amount of snow melt and the ice loses strength, it's a thermal breakup. And years when we've got sort of cold, strong, hard ice and a rapid snow melt, that's when we get mechanical breakups.
So Anne had asked a related question of what weather events precede a bad ice jam. So you're talking about the key elements being snowpack and ice, right? The ice thickness and stuff.
Yeah, and weather plays a big part, and that so we've identified sort of two unfavorable weather conditions, and that would be record warm temperatures towards the latter part of April, and that can lead to ice jams. And the other unfavorable weather pattern would be cooler than normal conditions through the entire month of April and early May. And so that delays snowmelt, and then it's keeps our ice strong in place, and then we get rapid snowmelt in May. And 2009 and 2013 are interesting. One had record warm temperatures that caused ice jam flooding, and the other had a prolonged cool spring that delayed breakup.
That's really interesting. Well, I think we'll hold on to the rest of our questions for now, and then we'll go on to your next section because I know you have a lot to share with us.
That sounds great, thanks. So now I'll jump into the program that we called Riverwatch. We as the River Forecast Center monitor rivers throughout the winter, and towards the end I'll provide our outlook for 2021. But really what we understand as hydrologists is we can't predict when an ice jam will occur and how severe it'll be. We can lean towards they're more likely this year or less likely this year, but really to provide information for communities, we need to be out there. And so the plane on the left, that's what we do. It's a joint mission between the state of Alaska, local communities, elders that we work with, and the Weather Service to monitor breakup, and we do it from the air. The map on the right is sort of the map of Alaska. The rivers are in white, and then all the communities of concern or the communities that could have ice jam flooding are the little dots along the rivers. And so throughout the season, we'll change this map and show the community status, whether there's a warning, a watch, or an advisory in place. And then the river status shown to the right, we'll change that as the rivers go from completely ice covered. At the end of breakup, everything is blue or open. The center image are some of the newer tools. Typically Riverwatch has been this aerial mission where we fly in small planes throughout the state. It lasts for about 3 to 4 weeks. Starting about the end of next week, I'll be up on the Yukon River for about 7 days. I'll fly from the border all the way about midway downriver. But we've started to use more and more newer tools that are sort of spaceborne tools to monitor river ice. And so the center image is sort of like a Google Earth type image that's from a satellite in space. And what we do is we try to classify the ice or the river as ice covered or open water. And so we're using more tools like this, but we're still not at the point where we can sort of transition from our typical monitoring from the air. And this is just another picture of this sort of transition from frozen rivers to open rivers. This is what I'll be monitoring for 7 or 10 days next week. And that's basically, we try to watch the breakup front. Rivers break up from upstream to downstream. So on the Yukon, it's sort of, the river flows from west to east. And so we'll start all the way on the west side, monitor breakup as it moves downriver, and be trying to track this breakup front, we call it. And so the river is flowing away from us. And if we look at the distance, we can see it's completely ice covered in place ice, just solid in place ice. And then it transitions to what we call sheet ice. We've got some larger sheets, and then we have a technical current term, just chunk ice for the small little chunks. And that's sort of the best kind of ice to see during breakup. It's been ground down to small chunks that won't jam. And then if we continued upriver here, we'd see it's completely open. And so what we'll do is we'll track this for almost 1,200 miles, this transition, and be monitoring for ice jams. I think we had a great question before about what we can do. And really, we can't stop or prevent an ice jam, but what we can do is provide warning and provide time to prepare. So we can identify if an ice jam forms, and then let a community know quickly that an ice jam's formed, and they have to prepare for imminent flooding or flooding that'll occur within hours. This is a picture again, a little closer up of Galena, and you can just see how jumbled the ice jam is. The toe of the ice jam, or the furthest downstream portion of the ice jam, was at Bishop's Rock. Another look, Galena is off in the distance there. This is the same time period. This was 2013, and just a quick look from Bishop's Rock all the way upstream. And so you can see this is, we said, where do ice jams form? And it's areas where the river changes course quickly, and also where we've got obstructions. So that we've got two things. We've got this S bend, and then we've got Bishop's Rock that pinches in on the Yukon River. And so this is just a view of that ice jam as it occurred, probably similar, same day as the previous picture. So it doesn't look like much here, but then as you move upstream, you'll see more jumbled and jammed ice towards Galena. So what we'll do is, I've got a video from a Riverwatch mission back in 2015 that we'll look at, and I think gives you an idea of exactly what we do in the air, and how we communicate directly to the communities on the ground. So Lisa mentioned you may need to bring the video maybe behind your browser. And once it loads here, I'll hit play. Okay, it's loaded, and I'll hit play.
People are in their village, they can't go out, and they don't know what the ice is doing. So with information like that, it prepares the people, and they have knowledge, about what's happening in their area, and that can go a long ways. Yeah, good evening, Tuluksak. This is Riverwatch. Nagtanong ka patingokot kaya siniwi tangik to good little bit of a report on the Upriver Ice. The end of the ice run is at Chowakpaluk, about a mile and a half, and it appears to be ice-free from there.
All emergencies are local, and so in working with the communities and in working with the scientists over at the Weather Service, we're able to join together some important partners in dealing with emergencies and preparing for them, and just doing our best to keep each other safe.
The significant ice is between Aniak and Kalskak and Coppice Bend.
Would you characterize this as a jam or more of just a place where it's rotting in place?
I call it sheet ice in place.
The Kuskokwim and the Yukon are unique, and we actually fly them, but there's also the Koyukuk, Buckland, the NOAA TAC, and so those are more, we're calling communities, finding out what's going on, trying to give information back, provide information that we've heard back to those, but the Kuskokwim and the Yukon are the two that are unique, where we fly each year.
Riverwatch is a great reason to reach out to the communities. Everyone's interested, everyone's already ready to talk to us, so we just give them a call, touch base as often as we can with pretty much anyone who's willing to answer the phone for us, make sure that we have information and can contact all of the communities if there is something happening any time of the year.
A lot of calls that I got, were wondering if is that it? Is there no more ice upstream? Yes, there's 60 miles of ice that's above Bethel, still yet to come down. I do enjoy reading River Ice and watching Breakup. It's, to me, a very important time of the year for, a river. A river is our lifeline.
Okay, I'll go ahead and share my screen.
So we did get a couple of questions from the video and what you were talking about with Riverwatch, if you have time for a few questions here.
Let's go ahead and do that. That's great.
Okay, so Carol was wondering how many people are assigned to fly the Yukon River when you're doing this. We noticed that there were several people in the plane.
So Carol, it's a good question. Typically what we do is it's a partnership with the state. And so there'll be one weather service, one state employee, and then Peter Atchak was a local community elder that flies with us occasionally. So probably 2 to 3, sort of the core Riverwatch mission. And we break it up into sections of river. So the Yukon, there'll be 3 teams. I'll do the upper Yukon. We've got a separate team on the middle and the lower. And so overall on the Yukon, we have anywhere from 6 to 10 people involved in Riverwatch, but just one team's out at a time. I'll be out for about 7 to 10 days, middle Yukon a few days, and then lower Yukon about a week.
So, and a related question to that is that because you were talking about how river breakup starts at the upriver end of things, do you, because you only have one team out on the river at a time, does the upriver team go for a certain amount of time until breakup happens on that upriver part, and then you switch to middle, or are you flying the whole river at the same time?
Usually it will transition. It's a progression from upstream to downstream, and usually it's not time-based, it's location. So when Breakup is downstream of Stevens Village and upstream of Tanana Village, we transition to the middle Yukon team. So it's TBD, to be determined how long I'll be out there. And then the same with the middle and the lower. The Kuskokwim is a smaller team. They fly the entire river. That river usually breaks up on the order of 7 to 10 days total. So it's just one team of 2 to 4 people that fly the Kuskokwim.
Right. Okay, Eve was wondering, do you also collaborate with teams in Canada? Because we know that the Yukon starts out in Canada and moves through Alaska.
We do, yeah, and that's one of the unique parts of working in the RFC. Most government agencies are tied to the border. the US border. And as you saw, the Yukon River goes into Canada, and about a third of the Yukon watershed is on the Canadian side. So we do collaborate with the Yukon Territory. And so we sort of trade river notes throughout the season and then share our outlooks with them. And then as they begin to break up, they have a similar Riverwatch mission. And so there has been times over the years where the US and the Canadian Riverwatch teams will fly past each other when breakup is right near the border.
Wow, that's pretty cool. So Theodore
It
was
is.
wondering, what kind of plane do you fly on the surveys?
Usually, if you know, it's usually a small Cessna, a 207, occasionally a small twin engine, but it's usually on the order of 5 to 7 passenger small plane.
And he also wanted to know whether you fly one.
I don't. One of the few. I've always wanted to, but I think work and other things have gotten in the way.
And let's see. So Carol was wondering about, you know, on the video we were seeing that the folks in the plane were giving reports out by radio, I believe. So who are you talking to in the villages that who you're giving your reports to?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's unique in Alaska, where communities use marine radio for communication. And that was before we had telephone or even cellular phones. It's just in the last 10 years where all those communities in Alaska started to get cell phones. And so prior to that, it was cheaper and more and easier just to use marine radio to communicate within the town. And so what we do is we talk direct from the planes to the communities on whatever local frequency they use. And we just basically broadcast what we've seen. When we get a local community member to fly with us, like Peter Atchak, it's great because we can give a brief in English, and then Peter can translate into the local language. And so that's helpful. So it is sort of direct to the community members.
Do you have community members from a lot of different communities who fly with you?
From year to year, it varies. Typically, you know, in the last 2 years, it's been challenging under COVID. And so this year, we still aren't sure, you know, how we'll handle partnering with local community members. But typically, if there's a tribal member or local city official that's interested, we'll try to, especially if there's a concern locally, we'll try to include them on a local flight, at least to let them know and see what's happening upstream or downstream. But typically, probably we get 3 or 4 community members that participate each spring. And we really draw, I mean, I think I can completely relate to Peter. Watching River Ice is just fascinating. And he's got 5 or 6 decades of experience that we can learn from.
And related to that, we were wondering, are there traditional knowledge histories of different flooding events that have happened and where they've happened?
Definitely, yeah. And we lean on our local partners for names. Most of the names we use aren't on USGS maps. They're often somebody's fish camp or a traditional name for a bend in the river, and often they're associated with ice jam locations. And so we try to sort of gather as much as we can during breakup as we work with local partners, and then document it on our maps so that in the future we're prepared to sort of use the same names that they use along these rivers.
Wow, that's a great example of how the traditional knowledge from the local areas can augment your maps and sort of document all of these events.
Yeah, I always joke with folks, and I'm serious. Is when we call out, usually one of our strongest, one of our tools we use is the telephone, and we'll call out to a community, and often we'll ask, you know, what do you think? Are you concerned? Is this something you've seen before? Because those are from the office in Anchorage, from satellites, we can't measure that or detect that. It's the local community that sees it year to year, and we help communicate that up and down river. So partner with those members.
That's great. Yeah, I've often thought about how, we have these highly technological ways of gathering information, but we always need to have that ground truthing of what's going on at the ground level that people can see.
Definitely.
All right, well, let's hold on to our questions for now, and we'll go on to your next section, and because I know you have some more things to share with us.
Sounds great. Thanks, Lisa. And you can see my screen. I'll advance to the next slide, yes, which we just covered. I'll just highlight the photo. This is Aniak on the Kuskokwim River. And so Aniak's an area of concern, and this is Breakup a few years back, and just sort of shows. And this is mechanical breakup, but there was no ice jam flooding this year. So what I talked about, we can't prevent ice jams, but what the Weather Service can do is provide warning. And so what we do is we've got two main products, sort of that one in the middle. We do issue a flood watch. And so that's where we tell communities things are favorable, time to watch, time to get ready. And what we do is we'll issue that from the plane direct to the communities, and we'll say, we are worried about an ice jam. And so we're going to issue a flood watch, and the first message will just be verbal, and then we'll go back to the office or relay back to the office, and they'll issue a flood watch that would come over the TV or over the radio, but really it's from that plane is the direct communication. And then the next level up is flood warning, and so that's the take action. It's happening, and water is going to rise. It's imminent. This is the time that all your preparation is done, and now you need to probably relocate. They'll say a sort of local evacuation, go to high ground, move anything up that you can. But this is the ice jam's formed, and expect the water to rise. And so those are the tools we have through the Weather Service to let people know. But I think the real sort of amazing part of Riverwatch is that it's usually direct from the plane to the communities. And so I look at it as just a great, it's the federal government, the state government, and then locals, like all on the same page for Breakup. So now we'll look at sort of where we think we're at for 2021 or this year's Breakup. And so there's three main components we consider when we look at the Breakup outlook. And so the first one is ice. And so we're interested in the thickness of the ice, and if there were any unusual conditions in the winter that would lead to jumbled ice formations or areas of our rivers that are thicker than normal. The next ingredient is snowpack, and so that's upstream in the watershed, and that's the amount of water that would be available to melt and then flow into the rivers. And so more snow tends to heighten our awareness towards a mechanical breakup. The other sort of competing factor for snowpack is that it functions as a blanket. So if we had a heavy snowpack on the river, sometimes that can actually slow the growth of ice. And then the third component is spring weather that I touched on earlier. And so that spring weather is probably the most important factor determining whether it'll be a thermal breakup or a mechanical breakup. We tend to have outlooks based on the first two. And then what we really need to do is sort of watch the weather as we get through April and May and highlight if we're headed more towards thermal or mechanical. It's really those late April and May temperatures that control. And I sort of highlighted the two unfavorable conditions, and that would be record warm temperatures. 2009 was a great example. I was in Fairbanks doing snow surveys, sort of field hydrology, and I remember 70-degree days right around the end of April, which was record highs at the time. And then that year we did have ice jams. And then the other sort of unfavorable is if we get just cool conditions throughout the month of April and early May. So this year I'll look at the three components briefly. The first is ice thickness. And so on the left, what we try to do is measure the amount of cold that happened all winter. And so we have a term we call freezing degree days. And so each day we figure out how far below freezing the average temperature was, and then we add that up for the entire winter. And so it's sort of a measure of how cold winter was. And then we compare that to previous years. And so on this map on the left, you can see if it's white, it's near normal. If it's shades of blue, was a little colder than normal, and then shades of yellow a little below normal. But in general, everything within Alaska was near normal, sort of 90% up to 110, 115%, but sort of in that normal range for the amount of cold throughout the winter. And that we try to relate to ice thickness. So we, just from the air temperature, we'd expect probably near normal ice thickness throughout the state. It wasn't very thin, and it maybe wasn't very thick conditions for forming. So then on the right, we need the ground truth, because we've got sort of snow and ice, and the way they relate together can drive how thick the ice is. And so we work with local observers throughout the state and try to get actual ice measurements. And so the map on the right shows actual ice measurements at the beginning of April. And you can see the shades of green are sort of in the normal range. And then I've got two areas highlighted. And so on the right is an area where we see 127% of normal. So that's thicker than normal ice this year. And I've circled that area because reports, we keep track of rivers throughout the winter. And the reports from locals in multiple locations on the Yukon River there were that we had freeze-up jams and we have thick jumbled ice between Eagle and Dawson City, to the point where they couldn't put any snow machine trails on the river. It was too rough. And so that's definitely an area we're concerned about. We've got thicker, stronger ice than typical. And so we'll watch that area closely. And then the other area I've highlighted, sort of on the left with the blue square, is Galena. And so we've got a nice thickness that's below normal. And since we got this measurement back on April 1st, we followed up with several communities near Galena. And that ice thickness is representative of conditions around Galena. Due to the thick snowpack, it sort of formed a blanket and didn't allow that cold air to freeze the ice very thick this year in the lower Galena, in the lower Yukon area. The next sort of ingredient I talked about was snowpack. And so the map in the center is a map of Alaska's snowpack on April 1st. And the way we look at that is this is shades of blue indicate deeper snow, more snow than average. And then shades of red are thinner snow or less snow than average. And then the real sort of key message here is the dark blue in the bottom left of the image is the Kuskokwim River Basin. So one of those big rivers we've talked about, we're concerned about. And that has 180% average snowpack. So it's much thicker or much above average for the snowpack in the Kuskokwim. So there's that much snow that can melt and sort of drive the river ice during the breakup time period. We're also concerned, like I mentioned, we've got to go into Canada. And so on the right is the same map put out by the Yukon Territory, and shades of blue again are above average snowpack. And so if we look at the Yukon River upstream from the US border, we've got about 125, 130% of average. So it's slightly above average there as well. So if we sort of combine our look of river ice throughout the state, our understanding of it, and then our understanding of the snowpack throughout the state, we come out with our breakup outlook based on those two and a sort of general understanding of the weather for the next 3 to 4 weeks. And that's probably the hardest thing to really predict is the weather. The Weather Service is really good for the first 7 days. And then beyond that, we look at sort of general outlooks. Will it be above normal or below normal temperatures? We don't have any tools that could predict a record high temperature day in 3 to 4 weeks. And we don't have any tools that'll tell us if we're going to have a 6 week long, prolonged below average temperatures. We have tools that can tell us like one above or below is more likely, but we're not there with the tools that could really tell us if we've got these unfavorable conditions ahead. But if we look at those two or three factors, we think that we're trending towards mechanical on Alaska's major rivers. At the bottom there, it's just we're shifting our outlook towards mechanical. Some years we're way over to the right. Over the last 7 or 8 years, we've been mostly over to the right and thermal. And 2020 and 2021 we're sort of towards the left and mechanical. And then throughout the state, the two areas we're concerned about are the Kuskokwim River with that above average snowpack, and then the upper Yukon River, Eagle and Circle with above average snowpack in the Yukon Territory, and then that midwinter jumbled ice that's in place. And then throughout the rest of the state, we vary from sort of average flood potential to below average in some locations. We put out our outlook in graphical format. And so this is a map of Alaska. It's got our rivers shown. The major river east to west is the Yukon. And so each community that we're concerned about for ice jam or snowmelt flooding has a little dot, and then we sort of rank the flood potential based on where we are this year and related to the historical amount of floods they've had in that community. And so the Yukon, you can see 2 yellow dots up near the border, and that's Eagle and Circle, sort of in the moderate range. And then the Kuskokwim is that river down to the lower left with quite a few yellow dots in the moderate range, primarily due to that snowpack. And then other rivers are generally colored sort of in the low to moderate flood potential. And that's related to how likely it is to flood on any given year. Some communities that are low are just, they're very elevated and not susceptible to ice jam flooding. But it's always, I think what I've learned through monitoring Breakup is that even on a low risk year, there's still a risk, and the communities are always concerned about Breakup. It's the time of year when flooding could happen on any given year, and it's the time to really prepare and be alert. The other thing we look at is Breakup timing. And so, and that's related to people want to sort of plan or understand, are we gonna have to wait a little longer to get our boats out? Are we gonna be able to get our boats out sooner? And so this is just a general look of Breakup timing throughout the state. The one community I underlined is Nikolai on the 23rd of April. As of today, it hasn't broken up yet. And so we'll look at that as an indicator of if we're early or late. That's the first spot that we monitor. And so in general, we think Breakup might be on the order of 1 to a few days late throughout the state. So maybe we'll stop there and take questions on the outlook.
Right. Yeah, so Theodore was wondering, is there a Breakup happening right now somewhere? You had mentioned that next week you're going out on the Yukon. And so we were wondering whether you had already gone out and whether there's potential or there is some Breakup happening.
So it's interesting because this morning, as I started to check email, we had one river gauge south of Anchorage on the Kenai Peninsula that had a unusual reading, and we suspect that it broke up and there's an ice jam. We followed up with the fire department, and it sounds like there's an ice jam in place. It's not one we monitor by air, and the impacts are minor. It wouldn't flood a community. There's some roads, campground, a few homes that could be threatened. But we are just at the very front edge of Breakup in Alaska. And so the Anchor River is the one that has the ice jam. It broke up today, and that's 2 days late on average. So it's sort of tracking with where we think that Breakup will be delayed after the average date of Breakup.
So yeah, everything is starting to happen right now. I have one more question before we go to, actually 2 more questions before we go to the next section. We have about 7 minutes left, so I want to be conscious of our time. Texas was wondering whether you ever use man-made or mechanical ways to break up an ice jam.
So we, as part of the Riverwatch program and as part of how things are handled in Alaska, we don't. The state and the Weather Service doesn't use any mechanical methods. There are usually, if it's a mechanical method, it'll be the local town, local city. And so as an example, last year, there was an ice jam that formed midwinter in Willow, Alaska, and the borough used mechanical excavators to remove that ice jam. And so it is done. It's not something we're typically part of as sort of the Riverwatch mission, but on the small scale, cities, communities do sometimes take action to remove the ice jam. And in that case, they use the excavator to actually just dig out the river and remove the river ice.
I'd imagine with those ice chunks being as large as they are, you'd need a pretty large excavator to do that.
It was a much smaller river, Willow. It's maybe 100 feet across, 100 to 200 feet across. So smaller ice chunks. Historically,
go ahead.
Historically, there has been the use of explosives, but typically it's not found to be very effective, and it can cause more harm than it does good.
Yeah, I'd imagine. Let's see. Mabel and Ruby from Arizona were wondering, do you ever enter guesses in the Nenana Ice Classic? So I think that that's a good segue to our next section, and then you can answer their question while you're talking about the Ice Classic.
Yeah, Mabel, if you're from Alaska, you know we don't have a lottery, but we have the Nenana Ice Classic. So I don't. I think our office is like an unwritten rule that we probably don't enter the Ice Classic. I don't know if we would do any better than just we have some tools, but it is sort of this process we can't really pencil out with an equation, and so it's monitoring that's required. And so we don't have a lottery in Alaska. We do have, this is Nenana, the town of Nenana. It sits on the Tanana River, and every year for the last many decades, they stick a tripod out in the middle of the river, which you see there in the center, and then they tie a string back to a tripod tower, and then the string goes over a pulley down to a clock. And when that tripod moves 100 feet downstream, it triggers the clock, and whoever has the lucky guess for the hour and minute gets the jackpot. So and this was from a few days ago. So it's really something everybody tracks in Alaska is when has the ice gone out in Nenana, and it's a great data set for scientific purposes because it's every year the same exact measurement, and so we can track the breakup date over the last almost 100 years. And we've seen that breakup happens about a week earlier at Nenana on the Tanana River than it has historically.
Wow, that's pretty cool. So I know that you have one more thing to talk about, and we've got about 4 minutes, so I'll let you keep on going.
I think we've got one or two more slides. So one thing really that we're always concerned about in the springtime is ice safety. So we're transitioning from ice cover we can travel on to ice cover that's unsafe. And so really it's a time to talk to elders, talk to parents, and evaluate conditions, because there will be a time when it's unsafe to travel on ice. So that's something we always want to remind folks. That picture is sort of the classic, truck through the ice and then trying to get it out. But it's a really dangerous condition that we want everybody to be aware of, and we all know it. It's just a matter of understanding when that transition happens. And I think we're at the end there, Lisa.
Great. Well, we did have a couple more questions, so I'll take one or two questions before we have to go. So let's see. Anna Maria was wondering, why don't you use drones?
We do use drones, and often what we'll do is some local student or community member will share drone footage via Facebook or YouTube, and that's mostly how we use drones. We are in the air ourselves, and so we don't really have that need when I'm out on Riverwatch to have a drone, but it's great when a community member can sort of pop up and take a look at the river and share that footage with us. Great.
And then Nancy was wondering, for communities that are commonly flooded, have they had to think about moving their villages, or have villages had to move because of flooding?
They think about, Galena is a great example. Two floods, 2009 and then 2013 was really significant. And what they do is they'll tend to relocate structures. Sometimes it's actually physically move the building to higher ground. Sometimes it's relocate and it's just elevate the structure. So they'll elevate it so that the first floor is above where we think ice jam flooding could happen.
Great. Well, we're just about at the end of our time. So thank you so much, Crane, for sharing all of this knowledge about ice jams with us. And I feel like we always learn something new from each of our speakers. And it's great to know how the knowledge is used to help out communities in Alaska.
That's great. Yeah, thanks for having us, and thanks for the great questions, everybody.
All right. Thank you, everybody, for coming and listening to our webinar, and we will be back next week to talk about North Pacific right whales. So thanks very much. Bye-bye.